Welcome to the Music Recital Hall at Santa Clara University. Please take a moment to turn off and put away your cell phones. In the event of an emergency, you'll want to know the closest exits. Please take a moment to locate them now. Thank you.
Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I know you wanted to be at the basketball game, but, this is more important. So what can I say? You're going to have a very exciting intellectual experience this evening with our guests, and I just wanted to say a few short words before I hand the microphone over to Dr. Justin Clardy. I'm Amy Randall, Director of the College of Art and Sciences Center for the Arts and Humanities. Along with Dr. Danielle Morgan, the Center's Associate Director, and Britt Kane, the Center's Manager, we thank you for joining us. Tonight's event is a product of our Faculty Fellow series, in which the Center's yearly Faculty Fellows engage in planning and hosting an event for the Santa Clara University community and beyond. Every year, the Center supports faculty and student fellows to pursue their projects and build community. This evening's Fireside Chat on Civic Indifference and Black Suffering has been conceptualized and organized by Dr. Justin Clardy, and it includes our esteemed guests, Kevin Morse and Dr. Frank Wilderson. A huge thanks to Professor Clardy and our guests for participating in tonight's Fireside Chat. Dr. Clardy, Assistant Professor in the Philosophy Department, is an accomplished scholar and professor, and as we like to say in the Boston area where I grew up, and this is inspired by one of our guests, he is wicked smart. Seriously, it is a privilege to be in dialogue with him whenever I have the opportunity. Some of his recent publications include Civic Tenderness and Child Poverty in America, and Ill-Fated Portrayals of Black Non-Monogamy and Their Harmful Consequences. With these few words, let me hand the microphone over to Dr. Clardy to introduce this evening's program in much more detail. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here with us tonight at Santa Clara University for this Fireside Chat on Civic Indifference. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we are gathered on. Santa Clara University sits on the land of the Ohlone and the Muwekma Ohlone people, who traced their ancestry through the Mission Dolores, Santa Clara, and San Jose. We honor their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to live, work, and reflect on their traditional homeland. Let us take a moment of silence to pay respect to their elders and to all Ohlone people, past and present. Thank you. My name is Professor Justin Clardy, pronouns he, they. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy here at Santa Clara University. My work focuses on relationships, emotions, attitudes, particularly love, tenderness, indifference, and empathy, alongside broader questions in social and political philosophy, particularly regarding race, racialization, and the socio-political and socio-ontological position of those marked Black. I am deeply honored to be here with you all this evening and excited to engage in conversation with Frank Wilderson and Kevin Morse in just a few moments. This event would not have been possible without the generous support of Santa Clara University's Department of Philosophy, Department of Political Science, Department of Religious Studies, Department of Sociology, Department of Ethnic Studies, Department of English, the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies. We're also grateful for the broader institutional support from the Division of Inclusive Excellence, the Office of Multicultural Learning, the Black Justice Studies Collaborative, Santa Clara Presents, as well as the Center for the Arts and Humanities. A special thank you to Britt Kane, Danielle Morgan, and Amy Randall for their invaluable labor in helping bring this event to life, as well as the team at Blue Flower Arts, and of course, Frank Wilderson and Kevin Morris for their generosity in joining us this evening. Our discussion tonight will unfold over the next hour or so, with roughly 20 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. This event is also being streamed live, allowing us to connect not only in this room, but with a global audience tuning in virtually. This evening's conversation brings together perspectives from across disciplines, an English scholar, a philosopher, and a Chancellor's Professor of African American Studies. In many ways, our gathering tonight reflects the evolution of Afro-pessimism as a school of thought, spanning 3 generations of scholars. A testament to the foundational work of Frank Wilderson, Jared Sexton, Sadia Hartman, Hortense Spillers, Fred Moten, Calvin Warren, Sylvia Winter, and others, whose intellectual contributions have made it possible for us to engage in this dialogue today. With that, I will turn things over to Darcy Muller, an SCU philosophy major who will introduce Kevin Morse, and Lauren Fuller, a brilliant young philosopher I've had the privilege of working with for the better part of a year and a half on an undergraduate research project engaging with themes from Afro-pessimism. Lauren will introduce our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Wilderson.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Morse. Kevin is a doctoral candidate in the Department of English at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where his research explores 20th century Black literature through the lenses of carcerality, anti-Blackness, and the limitations of liberal humanism. His dissertation, All Black Literature is Carceral Literature, Chronotopes of Carcerality and the Black Novel, examines how Black authors depict carceral time spaces within the novel to challenge dominant narratives of progress, revealing the enduring connections between slavery and its carceral afterlives. Kevin's academic journey has been deeply interdisciplinary. He holds a bachelor's in philosophy and African American studies from the University of Arkansas Fayetteville and a master's in Pan-African studies from Syracuse University. Beyond his scholarly work, Kevin is a proud native of South Central Los Angeles, never South LA. But for nearly a decade, he has called Harlem his home. When he is not engaged in research, you can find him spending time with his dogs Bronny and Bosch, indulging in his love for sports, sneaker shopping, exploring museums, and embracing his inner old head as a dedicated hip-hop enthusiast. And now I'll turn it over to Lauren to introduce Dr. Frank Wilderson.
Professor Frank Wilderson III is a Chancellor's Professor of African American Studies and Drama at the University of California, Irvine. Professor Wilderson's legacy precedes him. He is an award-winning writer, poet, scholar, activist, and filmmaker. He has also been the recipient of numerous writing awards, such as the American Book Award and the Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Legacy Award for nonfiction for his book Incognito, a memoir of exile and apartheid, the Maya Angelou Award for Best Fiction portraying the Black experience in America, and the Eisner Prize for Creative Achievement of the Highest Order, amongst countless others. He is also the author of other influential works, such as Red, White, and Black, Cinema and the Structure of U.S. Antagonisms, as well as Afro-pessimism. Notably, Professor Wilderson was instrumental during his time spent in South Africa, where he taught at universities and helped the African National Congress to develop anti-apartheid resistance. Most aptly for the conversation we will engage in today, he is known for his foundational work regarding the school of thought known as Afro-pessimism. Afro-pessimism is a theoretical framework which maintains that the world was, is, and continues to rely on anti-Blackness for its continued existence. For thinkers engaging in these themes, this means that Black bodies, devoid of kinship and human status, live a characteristic existence centered on exploitation and the foreclosure of possibility. I cannot personally express how important Dr. Wilderson's work has been to me. As a framework, Afro-pessimism has offered me the invaluable gift of validation and the language to speak about my experience in a Black body. Additionally, on a deeper level, it has also pushed me to ask questions about the possibility of agency with courage in the face of this bleakness. I attended to this question in a year-long research experience with Dr. Clardy that resulted in a publication with Procopton, an undergraduate research journal. That being said, it is both an honor and a privilege to introduce someone whose scholarship has profoundly shaped others in my intellectual journey and continues to challenge the way that we understand the Black existence. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Frank Wilderson.
How you doing, man? Good job. Give me a second to just kind of take in my students doing the intros. I have like a tear. Yeah, but thank you for being with us tonight. How you doing?
I'm fine.
Good.
We had a good lunch.
We did. We did. Wonderful.
Like what they say, what happened in Vegas stays in Vegas.
Hello. Hello. Kevin, how you doing? You all right?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm here.
Good. Well, yeah, thank you guys for both being here. And, I kind of want to get things underway if we don't mind, right?
Sure.
All right. So tonight's Fireside Chat, of course, is on civic indifference and Black suffering. And it's customary for philosophers to begin with definitions. So as I was preparing for this conversation, I found myself polling colleagues and their intuitions about indifference. And time again, I was asked, well, what do you mean by indifference? Which I found amusing because I'm not always sure that I know what I mean by it. But especially as my own thinking on this concept has shifted. But I want to begin there. Frank, I want to sort of think about how you understand indifference and how it might show up in your work, alongside maybe a definition of Afro-pessimism for our audience to kind of bring them in.
The second part is easier than the first part.
Okay.
So and this is purely from me. I mean, I think that some of the people who've introduced have said that there have been generations of, or maybe you said it, of Afro-pessimism, which really kind of blew my mind, because I'm still stuck in 1999 when we were the scourge of the earth and nobody wanted to hear from us. But to think that generations have come along to fortify and extend this way of thinking is really remarkable. I think why it's remarkable, kind of sidewinding back to your question, is because it's basically a diagnostic. It's like an ear trumpet to the sounds of Black suffering. And so it's certainly not an intellectual discovery. I think that the first people who were cast as Black and African in this kind of coterminous event of 1625 to 1300 of the Arabs and Moroccan Jews and Iranians and Chinese all kind of vamping on the south of the Sahara and saying that these are people without rights and claims. These are objects of exchange as opposed to subjects and objects of exchange. At that point, I certainly believe that anyone who is being driven to the sea in coffles to be the eunuchs in harems, or for men or boys actually also, or sex slaves for girls and women, understood that at some level of analysis that the development of these people across the sea who are becoming what they are was inextricably bound to my destruction. And so they had a diagnostic of the ways in which the development of subjectivity of others was predicated on the destruction of subjectivities and the capacity, the transformative capacity of me. And so I think that part of the reason why a lot of people think of Afro-pessimism as something that has mugged them, is precisely not because of what it does, but what it doesn't do. It doesn't offer a way out. And so, but it's crazy, right? Because I've had cancer twice, and as I tell my students, neither time 2014 or 9 years later did I, when my oncologist said, whoa, your PSA rating is so off the chart that you've got a serious case of cancer, and showed me the diagnostic material that suggests that, and the contaminated lymph nodes, did I say, why did you do that to me? Mm-hmm. You typically don't accuse your doctor of your disease. Right. And so you appreciate the diagnostic. And I think that when it comes to Black people suffering, what most people want is this much of it, which is that much that is analogous to their suffering, but not anything more. So I think what it's all that we've done is systematized and provided an analytic framework for what has already been understood at various levels of abstraction, whether it's the intuitive or the argumentative, by us for 1,400 years. Mm-hmm. It asks, why is it, or how is it, that the capacity to transform endless duration into the event, time, genealogy, heritage, history, and the capacity to transform unnoted space into place is something that is granted to everyone but us. And then it gets to the point where that understanding of we are not granted recognition, reciprocity, and incorporation. We're not granted transformative capacity, precisely because if we were, there'd be no sentient beings over here who are outside of the realm of sentient beings over there. And any good semiotician understands that meaning reality and the real are different. Reality is what's constructed through language. And we live in reality, and we have no we only have indirect access and contact with the real. And so if you have people who live in reality, whose their ascent and destruction and fall is based upon what happens in language, in other words, discursive capacity, then there's got to be someone over here who has no access to transformative capacity. And so we've diagnosed that. And it has made a lot of people, your students who have introduced us have found that to be liberating. Others have found that to be a form of oppression Olympics, when it absolutely is not.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for that. And if you can, maybe say a little bit about maybe what you think about indifference and maybe how that shows up in the work. And I realize, too, that sort of given what you've just said, that what we might be witnessing in relation to Black suffering is maybe something other than indifference, right? Especially if indifference is sort of usually thought of as a passive attitude or state of affairs, as opposed to something more vitrolic, more hostile, so on and so forth. But if you do see indifference showing up, maybe if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, I was a little scared of the question when you sent it to me.
Oh no, what? I really doubt that.
Oh, I'm scared of everything. I just front. So could I say this? I'm not sure I understand. I think I understand what the question was that we talked about on the phone a little bit, but I'm not sure I would call it indifference.
Okay.
I don't know what I would call it, but I would say that I think in Scenes of Subjection, Cynthia Hartman does a very good job of using case studies of Black female slaves to show, especially in rape cases, to show how injury cannot be translated as something that happens to Black bodies. And I think that, Fanon goes to that place in a different way by suggesting that the function of the Black imago in the collective unconscious is to resolve all libidinal crises in the non-black world, which is a hell of a statement. Because what he's suggesting is that there's a hydraulics inside the white family, which understands that this filial configuration of whiteness and white filial configuration understands at some level that the white family is nothing more than a cutout of the state. And so the hydraulics of the organic, unethical nature of white filiation produces a kind of pressure on the brain, which is, and various people, depending upon how they're gendered, inside the white nuclear family are going to feel that pressure differently. But it's all a pressure of the unconscious not being able to calibrate its understanding that I live in an unethical social formation called white filiation with the preconscious iterations or utterances of the fact of, like, I love my father, I love my mother, I love my daughter. In other words, filial rationale for the integrity of a unit that is organically lacking in integrity is based upon words like love and blood, and it never gets over into the argument that my father, my mother, my sister, my daughter are ethical, or that we have in some way cut our relations to the state. It's simply it's not an argument. It's filial responses of integrity are assertions, and these assertions then are pressures on the brain, because they know that the brain knows that I'm wrong, this is wrong, we are wrong. And so that kind of pressure produces a kind of aggressivity which needs a grounding wire. It has to find an outlet. And the quintessential, always available outlet is black flesh. And so, which is another way of saying that black flesh is always available, as Fanon says, to resolve the inner conflicts of white filial institutions. And if that's the case, then how can you actually care for that flesh?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. I want to touch on that. But this bit about sort of the readiness of black flesh being put to all sorts of uses makes me think of your work, Kevin, and fungibility, right? How you work with the concept of fungibility. And so I want to invite you here to maybe say a little bit about that, but also similar question to you about indifference, if you see it showing up at all. So fungibility, indifference.
So, wow, I think maybe the idea of fungibility may inform what I have to say about indifference. I guess first for fungibility, this is building off of, obviously off of Frank's work and Sadia, but just thinking about those marked black as a accumulated object, right? And so I think about this most prominently through the lens of carcerality. I think it shows up in terms of how different carceral arrangements position those marked black in the world as always in proximity to confinement, always in proximity to surveillance, and obviously the wanton violence that comes from the state. And so in that, I guess this idea of fungibility in terms of how I'm thinking about indifference reverts me back to the word absence. Indifference, there's something, I guess the object that one is indifferent to, that there must be some sort of lack, there's something missing there, right? And so in thinking about what Frank just said about how do you care for the black, right? I think that's maybe where the indifference starts to come up at is what is that? What's missing? What's the absence?
Good.
That's rooted in that.
Good. I like that bit about sort of absence, and also what Frank was saying about sort of like being outside, right? Being outside of, as I've heard really elsewhere, right? The lingua franca, right? There being no grammar, right? To sort of not only depict the position of the black. If we can't even depict the position of black, we for damn sure can't really identify black suffering or even sort of like theorize about it in any sort of coherent way. And I think that thinking about the structural position of blackness makes me think about being outside of this lingua franca, outside of this social order, not simply at the bottom of it, right? Which is, I think, something that was coming through for me and what you were saying, Frank. Outside of social order, outside of kinship structure, and Kev, this bit about fungibility that you just added makes me think about whether or not the black or those marked black or blackness is even a thing that the world can be indifferent to. And also what you were saying about care, love, so on and so forth, right? Thinking about that.
I don't mean that we shouldn't try.
No, yeah, sure.
You know, this is a diagnostic of where we have been placed. And it's not a divine intervention. You know, God didn't produce this. But it is so, it is so much the truth of the paradigm that we have to accept what it took to get here and what it will take to get out.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to imagine a kind of redemptive imaginatory moment in our lifetime.
Good.
What does it mean to be, if capitalism is 400 years old, that's how long the worker has suffered, what does it mean for blackness to be coterminous with social death, to emerge with social death for 1,400 years? That's not civil rights. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We're not going to vote that out of power.
Yeah, no, seriously. I mean, and thinking about this sort of like not doing anything or doing anything, and it makes me think about how important the doing of something is important to narratives of progress or advancing this sort of larger historical narrative along, usually in the service of like some sort of story about incrementalism, making gains, progress, so on and so forth, but also, right, as a way of, in some ways, sort of suppressing what we might call radical action, radical thought, or anything like that. Is there anything that can be said about narratives, how they're functioning in this way, and whether or not that historical narrative is counterproductive to whatever project we might want to call Black liberation? And I mean, I'm sure throughout the talk tonight we'll be able to talk a lot more about this notion of Black liberation. But yeah, I'm interested in sort of the narrative, how it's functioning, especially given what you were saying earlier, Frank, about the pressure that gets put on the brain. And it seems that, I guess some other language is to say that that makes manifest in the kinds of political stakes people have and the kinds of things that they say, which I also think that this larger historical process is invested in. So maybe we can talk about historical narrative, this notion of progress.
Yeah. I mean, that's very good. I mean, my response is probably unpopular to a lot of people. But, you know, I mean, I don't know how to be diplomatic. So much of Black politics is really just anger management.
Oh, man. Bars. Yeah, no, seriously.
Okay. Not everybody laughs.
Yeah, no, but I think that
it's
that's
precisely because trying to narrate what cannot be narrated through a kind of pilgrim's progress of progress, you know, it frustrates as opposed to illuminates, and so it's more of a kind of intra-Black existential question. after you go down, you know, I remember when I was writing Red, White, and Black, and I would give C.D. Hartman was the brains behind. She wasn't the chair of my committee, but I considered her to be. You know how that works?
Yeah. I do.
You got some people on the committee you can't talk to. There's one person you can't.
You gotta get them signatures, though, either way.
But you got to get those signatures. Exactly. So, and I'm a chancellor's professor. I say anything I want to right now. You know? So, but, you know, 20 years ago, 21 years ago, she used to look at that. And it was really embarrassing sometimes. I'm a grown man, you know, I'm like 48 years old trying to get a PhD. And she's saying to me, this chapter here looks like you want to get out of the hold of the ship. Mm-hmm. And you need to stay in the hold of the ship. Because I was trying to read into, and this is very I'd be interested to know later what novels you're working on, because this is kind of intuitively typical of Black fiction, but also Black creative nonfiction. And I've often wondered, this thing I'm about to explain, is it us, or is it the anti-Blackness, the fear and aggressivity of our own imago inside of us, or is it the publisher and editor? And sometimes it's both, in which, you know, you get to the end and they say, this makes me feel bad.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah, and produce at the end of this text a redemptive denouement. So, you know, I don't care if your act is black and hell, you know, I am white and reading. Right. So this is what I need. You know what right. So give me a redemptive denouement.
And I think to that point too, it makes me think of a couple of things. And Kev, I'll invite you here to say something in a second. But it makes me think about my work on sort of Black non-monogamy and thinking about the ways that Black non-monogamous families might look, or the ways our relationships might look. And when I write about this, people always want me to tell some story about marriage reform, you know, as if that is going to solve the problem, when we can have deeper conversations, more meaningful conversations about the institution and its sort of stakes in white supremacy, whiteness, or anti-Blackness, however we want to spin it. That's one thing that it makes me think about, because you're right, there is this pull or this push to kind of say, yeah, that was a really depressing story about your love, but you know, love is supposed to be happy, like, you know, make me happy. So another thing it makes me think about is recently I was in Lisbon, Portugal, where I was presenting some of my work on Afro-pessimism for one of the first times, newer project, and I literally had a woman scholar in the audience, you know, by the time I was into my talk, said, you know, it bothers me that you're using those marked black to describe ultimately the position of blackness. And it makes me want to cry. And the woman literally started crying, and she says, you know, if we use this language of those marked black, can't I say those marked woman? And if you were to say those marked woman, I'd say fuck you, right? And this is literally at a professional conference where, right, and it was because, exactly what you're saying, the work that I was articulating kind of made her comfortable. I didn't really have a soft spot for her to land. But
it's a symptomatic response that she's giving you.
Absolutely. Which is like, this is the point. Yeah, exactly. This is the entire point right here, right? And so I think those who might have paid attention to the first 40 minutes of that talk probably saw it come to a head in that moment, which, you know, but I had to catch a flight, so I didn't get to mingle with too many people after, so thank goodness. But Kev, you know, talking about narratives, right? We've sort of been talking a little bit about like this larger historical narrative of progress, but you work in English, your work is in English. You focus on the novel, your dissertation is talking about all black novels being carceral in a particular sense. And when I think about the novel, right, what is a novel but a narrative? And so do you have maybe some thoughts that maybe you'd like to contribute here to thinking about narratives and how they function, whether to advance the project of anti-Blackness or to put an end to it or anything like that?
Yeah, so thinking about narrative as it pertains to progress, I think to Frank's point in talking about what are the limitations of progress ultimately, and sort of what are the limitations of that sort of this grammatical order, right? That sort of points us toward that redemptive denouement, right? And I think that's where the distinction between those marked black being in the world versus being for the world becomes particularly clear, because I think, again, as Frank said, the publisher wants you to, wants you to get off a story that's ultimately going to make the white consumer, the white reader, feel good about themselves. And in thinking about the ways that the novel, right, in particular, something that I'm working on is Beloved, and thinking about the neo-slave novel as a genre is something that I think is inherently opposed to sort of upholding those the sort of rationality of linear progress, right? That redemptive denouement suggests. For instance, in Beloved, we get Morrison going in and out of different temporalities. We have her using different forms of sort of different carceral formations, sort of dislocating those, upsetting the carceral sequential timeline, so to speak. All of these things to sort of like represent, as I suggest, is she shows that chattel is maintained on either side of the 1865 dividing line, which suggests that is the sort of paradigm that we still exist and that we still sort of operate under. And so thinking about narrative and its push toward anti-Blackness, I guess, I think is particularly important in thinking about the way that these stories tend, and maybe this isn't all black fiction, but most black fiction tends to bump against that inability to achieve that redemptive denouement, and sort of what we think about what are the implications of that, and sort of asking those questions.
Yeah, I think exactly. So what you're saying makes me think about, and I have a little bit of like background knowledge. It makes me think about to some of the work that you've been trying to do on Baldwin's Beale Street, right? And one of the things that you've said to me, thinking about this sort of disorientation or reorientation of time, is how for those marked black, right, like Fani, who is doing time, right? Time becomes a verb, right? For those marked black, it becomes more than just something that marks. Well, maybe it does actually mark positionality. I'd be interested in to hear about you. Maybe elaborate a little bit on that. Does this kind of bear some connection to what you see Morrison doing with the, I guess, chronotopes in Beloved?
Yeah.
Are there connections? Yeah.
So yes, okay. So in thinking about that now, the way that time. So it's interesting. So my idea of time goes back, as it pertains to those marked black, goes back to Hegel. When Hegel talks about the African is unhistorical, and so that the African is unhistorical and without movement. And so I think about, in terms of doing time, right? Thinking about the way that Fani is or any incarcerated person for that matter, any black incarcerated person for that matter, is not necessarily doing anything, right? The time, the time itself is doing right, and so that is what is contextualizing the space, the interaction, right? And so thinking about that, and I think that's something that is inherent to the black novel, right? Okay. In terms of how it's constructed as carceral literature, is because the way that time operates within the novel is as such that time is the one that's doing. Time is the sort of active agent.
That's really important.
Yeah.
That's really important.
Yeah. Do you care to say more, Frank?
Oh, no, it's profound. I mean, it's
Dang.
yeah. Yeah, it's what you're saying, Kevin, is precisely what separates a black person in prison from a white person or a Latinx person or an Asian person in prison. It's just prison then is just another iteration of a carcerality that has always been.
Yeah.
And I like that, yes. Yeah.
So sticking here with sort of the carceral, I guess, since that's what we're on, it makes me think also about language, not only in writing, but the process of just making arguments and positions legible to others, and the struggle that those working in or around the genre of Afro-pessimism have with doing this. It makes me think about not just your work with novels and things like that, but also, Frank, your work in creative writing. And I guess, or work with creative writing. And I guess I'm thinking, do we think that these forms of writing deepen our understanding, maybe, of what it might mean for Black people to suffer? Does it move us closer, in other words, to a grammar of Black suffering? Especially when we consider, one thing I sort of hear you saying, Kevin, and something that I've heard you say before, Frank, is that all Black talking is kind of carceral talking or incarcerated speech, right? So
that's his bar.
Yeah,
I got that bar from you.
I guess I am sort of because Kevin, it seems like your work would suggest that no, right? No matter what Black novel or whatever we're looking at, we're still going to be trapped into the same the context of carcerality. Nothing really moves us beyond that. So maybe, do you guys think that creative writing in particular might offer movement toward a grammar?
Well, I think we have to do what we love. I'm saying I'm pontificating on the stage at Santa Clara University like I'm on top of this shit, you know. Which all are paying me.
I struggle with it too, and I studied this shit. Okay,
but you know, that doesn't mean it's going to have the effect that we want. You know, sometimes I think about. I was a stockbroker for 8 years, and if I was still a stockbroker today, even though I'd have a twitch and an ulcer, and I'd be making, you know, based on the way my sales were going, $312,000 a year, but I'd have a lot less to think about. I understood less about my grammar of suffering then than I had before that, when I was an activist, you know, against the war and in Black Power in high school and in college. I went through a dumb period, which was a rich period. and now I'm in a middle class period. You know, but I'm being asked to tell people what I think, you know. so you know, but just not to get too tangential, but right to your point is I was Professor Patrice Douglas. Profound Afro-pessimist scholar at University of California, Berkeley, whose book is coming out in May. And I remember she was at the seminar table of a class I was teaching, and she said in the class, and you know, it was a time when Afro-pessimism had just exploded on the scene. Unfortunately, it exploded on the scene precisely because there was so much Black death in the streets. And it was, you know, Black scholars aspire to having our work connect with Black struggles, and we had no intention of that happening. We were simply people like Jared, myself, Jared Sexton, Sakia Jackson, Sorahan, Omar Ricks. I can't think of all the people, but we're just in the Bay Area saying that there's a way in which multiracial struggles are crowding out the voices of black people when we talk about how if the same police bullet kills a non-white, non-black person and it kills a black person, that the bullet doesn't come from the same structure of violence, you know. And that's not being heard in the multiracial coalition. And at the same time, in our graduate seminars on Marxism and psychoanalysis, they have nothing to say about a sentient being who lives in a soup of violence that is not predicated on transgression. In other words, anti-black violence is ritualistic, and it is a balm of B-A-L-M, of healing for everyone else. And neither Lacan nor Gramsci could accommodate that, and we weren't being accommodated in thinking through that, except for in small conversations with Sadia and with David Marriott, but certainly not in our classes. And so we thought, let's make a head-on intervention in this, just for that, just to give space in the activist circle and in the classroom. And I'm so sorry. What was your question?
No, I was thinking about sort of like whether or not
but
creative writing
yes.
moves us to the grammar of suffering. Yeah.
Okay. Well, the point is that the ontological structure of narrative is anti-black because it starts with an entity like a protagonist who moves from a position of plenitude into a crisis of disequilibrium, and then has the potential for moving into regaining equilibrium. So narrative itself is ideologically structured to have this kind of arc of a denouement. Now, if we intervene in that in ways in which try to address what we go through, then something happens. But I'm not willing to say what happens. Precisely because, as the question I was starting off with that Patrice Douglas asked in the seminar, she said, how do we keep Afro-pessimism black? And it just dawned on me that we can't. Because we're implements for the use of others. And just like, you know, as Orlando Patterson says in Slavery and Social Death, if the slave buys their freedom, nothing has really happened. Because the money that the slave had to buy their freedom was the master's money. Anyway, so it was all an extension of the master's prerogative.
It reminds me of the point that we were talking about a little bit earlier in the conversation about sort of the publisher, the writer, so on and so forth, right? That there's this larger publishing complex that, I see that dynamic coming through in what you've just said. I also want to talk about...
But I want to say one last little thing.
Please.
The fact that we're talking about this, if I may, 3 squibs on a stage. At a Jesuit university.
Say it. No, seriously.
Is not nothing. Okay? And, once there is... The reason why we are phobic objects and the Jew is a phobic subject is because the anxiety of the Jew comes from the sense of their conceptual framework as it is narrated through anti-Semitism will take over the banking world or take over all the positions in German schools. There's a conceptual anxiety, and the Jew represents a problem that can, just like the Native American, that may never be addressed, but can be addressed. It's a very
because it can be made legible.
It can be made legible. Just give Indians back their land and get the hell out of here or come under their sovereignty. But with the black, you're faced with a body that is flesh, that has not even been able to organize the spatiality into the place of the body. And so you're faced with a being who is demanding redress for something that is so large that it's incomprehensible.
Sure.
And which is what makes Black people so attractive to multiracial coalitions, because the energy that we bring is off the hook. But it also makes us dangerous once people get their shit. Right?
Yeah, no, seriously.
Because now they've got Black people in their space.
Yeah. And then there's a couple of things there, and Kevin, I know I wanted to invite you to say something about creative writing and moving closer to a grammar of Black suffering, but, you know, Frank, you were talking about sort of like there being bodies in the street, you know, en masse at the advent, or the sort of Afro-pessimism sort of coming onto the scene, and it makes me think about sort of the reiteration, or the iteration and the reiterativeness, I guess, of that very same process. It's what drove Kevin and I together in, although we were bi-coastal at the time, 2020, right? We're talking George Floyd, we're talking pandemic, right? There's still bodies in the street. Bodies were taken to the street to protest and so on and so forth. But prior to that, right, we have sort of the emergence of a Black Lives Matter movement, which is a phrase that I've thought a lot about, especially in relation to indifference, right? What does it mean to matter? Can a Black life matter, right, in a world that is indifferent to its suffering, right? And what might that look like, right? Because in a world where Black lives already matter to the social or political order of things, right, that phrase doesn't even emerge, right? It's redundant at that point. And so I guess I say that to say, like, we're still seeing bodies piling up on the street, and that leading to this proclamation that Black lives matter to what, right? To an indifferent world, to an indifferent social order. For whom might we, or those who are expressing that proclamation, who's the audience, right?
Yeah, that's the key.
Yeah, who's the audience?
Yeah, that's the key.
Yeah.
That's the question.
Yeah, so, that's it.
Yeah.
I guess I'm thinking about the phrase itself, Black Lives Matter. And so your question, what would that mean?
Because in some senses, it seems to maybe provide a grammar of Black suffering in its own right, right?
Or
not
attempt,
right? Yeah, not necessarily a grammar of Black suffering, as we've been sort of on about in our conversation here. But yeah, I do like this language of attempt. Yeah,
but I guess my question then is, are we prepared for what that world would look like, right? For Black lives to matter, because it can't be the current social order, right? Because if that were the case, then we're talking about completely unraveling this sort of narrative tapestry, right? That's already been woven.
Yeah.
And for a Black life to matter would mean, maybe Frank might like this, the end of the world, right?
I didn't say that.
But no, I think that in some very real sense, though. Like, I think that there's something to that.
I was just here.
I read it in his book.
Yeah. No, I think that there's some sense to that, though, right? Because, you know, in hearing you saying, like, will we be ready for that world, right? I think my mind, and perhaps the mind of some of our audience members might go to, like trying to lay out a picture of that world through the very same language that we found Carceral prior to, you know, getting to that project, which is why we can't provide a denouement, which is why it's very difficult and complicated for me to think about futurity or futures, right? And also liberation, Black liberation, whatever that might be, contained within that future or whatever.
And so, even the phrase itself is like constructed within within an oppressive context, right?
Yeah.
So even to think about the thought process behind the proclamation is, I think goes back to what I previously said, which is the world is incoherent at that point.
Yeah.
If those Black lives do matter, right? If those bodies in the street, if someone at whatever point cares, right? We think about Mike Brown laying out on the fucking ground for 6 hours or whatever it was, right? That shows you, you know, how much you matter in the real. And sort of then how we express the real through reality, right? In our construction of reality, we don't get closer to a grammar of Black suffering. We are still sort of grappling with the limitations of the grammar that we are presented with.
But that's important. What you're saying is really important, because us struggling with the way in which the world does not grant us transformative capacity.
Yes.
Is a very dangerous thing for the world. You know what I'm saying?
I do. Yeah. I absolutely do.
It's a very dangerous thing.
Yeah.
And Fanon says, and what I like about, in concerning violence, which he posits as coming off of the Algerian situation. But I read somewhere, and I can't remember, I've been reading creative writing texts for the past year or so, but one of his intellectual biographers said that, the first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth concerning violence was actually written in his Black Skin, White Mask period before he got to Algeria.
Interesting.
As a draft. And so what's interesting to me is that he says the native doesn't always speak the truth. And so what he's trying to say is that the preconscious register of the psyche isn't necessarily going to say colonialism is a bad thing. There are all kinds of people, from Malcolm X all the way to Justice Thomas. But the native is the truth. What is the native the truth of? The native is the truth of the settler's undoing. And so that what he's trying to say is that the native, and he's using land in a way that I don't think is helpful for the Black situation. That's why I kind of go back to the Black Skin, White Mask, but I'm being generous with taking some of the bits from that. He's basically saying that redress of this Algerian body is the return of land. Okay, and that alone would, and he's saying it is not a dialectical situation between the colonial and the settler. One realm is destroyed by the other realm. And so if we then transpose that back to away from colonialism, back to Blackness. In other words, if we go back to his first book to say that has greater explanatory power than the second one, then we would say that the Black doesn't always speak the truth. The Black is the truth, and this gets back to your end of the world. Right. What is the Black the truth of? The Black is the truth of the human's undoing. We have a situation in which human capacity is parasitic on the lack of capacity embodied in Blackness, and so we'd be at the cusp of an epistemological catastrophe, not an epistemological crisis that Marx presents with a new form of political economy,
right.
or an epistemological crisis that is implicit in Freud and Lacan, which is to say that it might be liberatory to reorganize kinship away, to destroy the veneer of Oedipus and reorganize kinship through something such as transgenderism, where the name of the father is not, the phallus is dispersed, the power is dispersed over amongst family members, a new kind of family, as opposed to what the Black embodies, which is the end of kinship itself. It doesn't mean the end of people breathing, although that's the kind of shit that would have to happen in some way or another, because if nobody's going to give up capitalism without a fight, they're certainly not going to give up human capacity.
No, and I encounter that. I encounter that a lot, I think, in conversations that I have. I mean, I think that the stakes are very clear for people, at the pre-conscious level, very clear for people, like what they might have to give up in order to really go there.
They have to give up their relational capacity.
Yeah, absolutely.
And come over to the Black side.
Yeah, which is interesting, sort of like, when you were talking about the end, like the Black would mean sort of like the end of that kind of kinship structure. And I was thinking sort of like, well, no, Blackness kind of like always already kind of just is that positioned in that non-kinship structure, as opposed to sort of situating it on this linear timeline where, right, your end of the world, right, comes about and new orders emerge or something like that. So yeah, no, that's good actually. I'm still kind of stuck on this bit about undoing. There's a lot there, and I'm also trying to be mindful of time. So I want to think about the present political moment, I guess.
It's a political moment?
Yeah, but
that's a straight up fascist.
Good. And so, yeah, I guess
the
I'm
undoing.
wondering. I guess I'm wondering.
Trump is a true American.
Man. I wonder, what are we, if anything, right, learning new about how blacks are suffering or continue to suffer under this, at present. I'll say that, right? Given a new administration, I mean, and this language of new administration, right, is a little bit tricky and misguiding. I don't really want to say. I mean, it makes me think about a talk that happened not too long ago where a speaker was saying, well, you know, this was pre-inauguration. Oh, two Americas are going to collide on Monday, and it's just like, dude, you know what I'm saying? It's like, no, like, two Americas have been colliding. I mean, and only two, right? Like, but anyways, I guess sort of also connecting this to your early comment about like bodies in the street and the sense in which I take that to sort of contribute to something like a collective depression. Or a collective, I don't know, just down feeling. We saw that in the first Trump administration, right? People were whatever about the Biden administration, but then we have this sort of second installation now of Trump. And I mean, I think that's something like a similar wave of, I don't know, I'll just say like depression, anxiety, angst, seems to be taking over people. For the first time, maybe in some senses. I guess I'm wondering whether or not that illuminates anything about what black suffering is at this political, or at this moment, right? Because people, going back to the narrative and thinking about history, are really quick to point out that whatever the nature of black suffering might be, we're not chattel anymore, right? We're not, this isn't the antebellum, so on and so forth.
Actually, if we come back to Kevin's dissertation, we are chattel.
Good.
You know, because there is actually more of us, and this is, I'm not even talking as Afro-pessimist, I'm just a straight up Marxist, right? There are more of us in chains per capita than there were in the 19th century.
Yeah.
If there's 1.5 million in prison, there's probably 5 million with some type of, you know, ankle bracelets or halfway house or going to prison at night and coming out in the daytime. I mean, we're actually in greater numbers in more cages than we were when 12 Years a Slave was made.
And that makes me think about sort of a lot of the activity that's been happening around ICE and deportation, so on and so forth. Is there anything that maybe shows up similar between the kind of suffering that is now enacting on groups of immigrant persons, so on and so forth, that resembles black suffering?
No.
I could anticipate.
I'm going to answer that one for you.
No, you know, and I'm just doing my job to facilitate. You know, but so maybe we can say more about why not then, right?
Because when Andrew Jackson was running for president, this is the first Andrew Jackson. This is the second Andrew Jackson. You know,
You're hilarious.
You know, he made a statement. He said on the campaign trail, he said, I have never met a recalcitrant Indian that I haven't killed. And I have never killed a recalcitrant Indian that I haven't scalped. And if any of you gentlemen in the audience are doubtful of that, you're welcome to come to my parlor after this speech, where I have arrayed over my mantle at the fireplace the scalps of 12 Native Indian chiefs. Okay? What's important here is that has nothing to do with black suffering. And as a rhetorician, you can pick that up, the contingency of it, and how it is analogous to immigrant suffering because of the word recalcitrant. The word recalcitrant imposes on the death a contingency. I have never met a recalcitrant Indian that I didn't kill. There's no such thing as recalcitrant black, because blackness is recalcitrant a priori.
Yeah, right.
And so my big waiting is like, I'm 68 in 10 months. I want to live a long time, but I like to die before they get to what they really mean.
Yeah.
And what they really mean is has to do with the fact that we are always already available to their whimsy, whether it's
the fungibility again.
The fungibility, exactly,
Yeah.
the fungibility. And so right now they're tottering. They're making their forays into recalcitrance. They cross the border. They want this, they want that. But at what is foundational is what is not being said, and it's symptomatic. And Trump is the first person who, Fanon says that after the Jewish Holocaust, it simply becomes no longer cricket to say this is a white man's country. The discourse of human rights takes over and becomes embarrassing. And so then what you get with respect to black liberation is a movement of the response is guilt from the white liberal unconscious, or conscious mind guilt, then resentment, then aggressivity. It doesn't go right to aggressivity, because the world, the civil society of the West represents itself to itself as being universally available, the right to be universally available. But they can't deal with that. So they move through these progressions like Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, guilt, resentment, then aggressivity. Well, we have now the person of the 19th century who's jumped, like in checkers. I'm just going to jump over guilt, right, resentment, and get right to aggressivity. And the first move was a quiet one, where he pardoned two white police officers who killed a black person in Washington, D.C. That was really quiet, But that form of aggressivity through mass police violence is what's on the horizon. Not this form, as horrifying as it is. This is recalcitrant. This is recalcitrance.
I appreciate you speaking to that point, Kevin. If you have anything to offer as a kind of like last word before we open it up to the
Just to that point, I think what the only sort of connections that I make in those forms of violence is, for instance, ICE or something like that, right? There has to be a reason, right? There has to be a reason. Anti-black violence can be just because you walked out, you got up and walked out the house that day, right? And I think that's the main thing is sort of like what that reason.
Or stayed in the house.
Or stayed in the house. But the other forms of state violence, police violence, seem to be contingent upon some sort of transgression of some sort, whether it be illegal immigration or anything in between. So that's it.
No, that's good. I mean, and I think that like you guys have both given me quite a bit to think about. I think on this point also, I mean, I've already been thinking about in some regards, but also in respect to my own project and like why I don't know, or really just frankly, I don't think that a framework of intersectionality quite gets at it, right? Because it seems that and I'm going to take it back to non-monogamy for a bit, but like non-monogamous black persons are over-determined already, kind of like by their blackness, to where, yeah, sure, we can make out a conflict between relational style or something like that, and then, try to work to solve that conflict, but that doesn't get us anywhere by way of the antagonism that blackness is for the world. And so with that, I think we can kind of turn to the crowd to maybe take some audience Q&A. And so, I will probably need some help facilitating some of this. But if you guys do have questions, I ask that you raise your hand up so that those coming around with microphones can find you. and speak up by way of projecting whatever your question might be. And thank you guys for helping. Yeah.
I'll start. Loud. Is it on? It's on. Okay.
Yeah, the online
Thank you for the brilliant conversation. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the end of the world, and just I'm wondering if it's imaginable. You know, if it's a horizon point that we can even see beyond, given the antagonistic construction of the world that we're in, and the inability to imagine Black suffering within this world. Yeah. Like, what do we know anything about the end of the world, or what's beyond it?
Good. I'll say a little bit. It makes me think here of a paper by a philosopher named Robin Jung called "Imagining an Oppressive Context," where she talks about the ways that the imagination imports and relies on many times racist tropes, anti-Black tropes, in order to reproduce images of some kind of futurity. And so I think in reading Jung's work, it would suggest that the imagination is always already handicapped in trying to conceive of a liberated point from an always already non-liberated positionality. And so that would speak to sort of like, really it being in some senses impossible to imagine. That's my take on it. I don't know if
I tend to agree, and I think the point, the last part that I didn't add was the end of the world as we know it, and so I think that may suggest even further that this isn't something that we can necessarily imagine from this particular vantage point, but that's a necessary step in order to actually. To actualize, right, this new relational dynamic, I guess. You have anything?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm interested also in maybe what you might have to say about the imagination, because, at lunch we were talking about, you're working on a work of fiction, and I imagine that being an imaginative process, and
Yeah, and I'm writing the ending because endings are a problem, given the structure of narrative, and I don't know what's going to happen there. I mean, but in direct answer to your question, I mean, if what I didn't say, I said Afro-pessimism is a diagnostic. And part of what frustrates people is, I'm not refusing your question. I'm as interested in it as you are. But I'm careful not to address it in anything I do, because I don't think that the tools of the symbolic order can actually address the site on the other side of the symbolic order. And so, and so, all the isms, post-colonialism, non-Black feminism, Marxism, psychoanalysis, they come with two rhetorical planks, right? One is the descriptive gesture, and the other is the prescriptive gesture. What does redress look like? And Afro-pessimism is unique and necessary in its absence of that prescriptive gesture. Because I think when I made the joke, which was not such a joke, that Black politics is just anger management, I was actually saying that, typically there's a bunch of old heads like me trying to tell young heads to channel your rage into a constructive sluice gate of some course. What can be constructive, as opposed to saying, I'm going to read your rage symptomatically as something that explains the world in a way that I haven't been able to or been unwilling to explain it. So I do think that things can change. I don't think that we can think of Black change in conceptually coherent ways.
There's another one, yeah, I think.
I want to ask, maybe to extend this conversation around change and social change. I wonder if there are, so I'm thinking back to the conversation around Black Lives Matter and how Afro-pessimism becomes more mainstream within the context of that social movement. So I'm wondering, what do you think that Afro-pessimism has to offer as far as framings or strategies or kind of agencies for social movements? In what ways can we harness the values and the lessons from Afro-pessimism to affect social movements, to strengthen them potentially?
Thank you. I think that's a great question. Can I listen? Mm-hmm. I mean, I used to give a lot of workshops on Afro-pessimism to chapters of Black Lives Matter, or more broadly, the movement of Black Lives, or community groups, say, in Oakland, Berkeley, Los Angeles, New York, Toronto, Chicago. The movement for Black Lives, I did a 3-hour workshop for the movement for Black Lives in Vienna, in Cape Town, Johannesburg, 40 Black activists at the Tate Modern Museum in London. And what was interesting to me about that is that Black people moving in reformist ways, against the system, receive such a disproportionate amount of violence and aggressivity just for asking for rights, that if the movement, that there are often times when the movement is open to another aspect of it, and that is the aspect of research, thought, intellectual expansion. And so, in South Africa, I conducted workshops on political theory to people, young people in Soweto, some of them who would have to go home and come back, to the United Nations Food Bank to get, grain, sacks of grain, and then come back. And so the thing that doesn't get popularized with respect to the spectacle movements in the streets is that movements that are asking or demanding reformist change, especially if they're Black, there's an intuitive understanding that Black reformist change can never happen. And oftentimes, they open up a kind of grassroots space for intellectual work, which says, we are worthy of our suffering, and let's have someone come in and help us workshop and explain an understanding of our suffering. I remember one time I was on a book tour, and I was asked, so what do you have against police brutality? And I said, nothing. There was this huge gasp, and I said, I'm not against police brutality, I'm against the police. Well, and that was, I was making a joke, but I was for real. And at that point, someone said, I'm in this organization, could you come and talk to us about what you just said? In other words, they're getting killed by cops randomly, ritualistically, and they have not given themselves permission to be anti-police. And so this is really important, that this space, which is, Afro-pessimism, you cannot organize a community around Afro-pessimism. You cannot organize a community around the end of the world. You can organize a community around tenants' rights, end of police brutality, transfer of payments rights to welfare, that kind of thing. Yeah. But that organization produces such horrific forms of violence because Black speech has no auditors, that people then begin to wonder, why isn't someone listening to me? And maybe I could use this space to, as I put it in these workshops, to have 2 trains running. One is the train of what you have to do to help this community just live better day to day. And the other is the train of trying to understand why, as Fanon says, our imago is available to resolve the inner conflict of everyone in the world. You know, and that is, that's dangerous in and of itself. The power to pose the question is the greatest power of all. And when black people start posing the question, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. It makes me, that is strikingly, I think, like similar to, I think, something that I've read in an interview between you and George Yancey, right, where he's asking a similar question about, like, the expansion of Afro-pessimism. How can we get, like, So, that was
did that help?
Yes, it did.
Oh, okay.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking today. I appreciate the conversation and the dialogue. I kind of have two questions. I'll ask the first one. I think it might be quicker. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that filio-pedagogy you mentioned. I guess I just don't know as much about that as I would like. Or the term.
One more time, a little bit louder.
The filio-pedagogy that you mentioned prior to those filio institutions.
Yes. Well, I would a better definition is a footnote somewhere in a book called "The World, the Text, and the Critic" by Edward Said, and I was really fortunate enough to be in Edward Said's Cultural Studies project. It ran for a year at Columbia, and there are two kind of ways in which people belong in the world. They belong through filiation, filial networks, which are family, and conceptually those are understood as relational through what in psychoanalysis might be called primary processes of signification. So they're not logical. They're almost pre-logical. They're like words like love, blood, kin, and it's like these assertions which are so vested that they don't need to be explained. And so if one is a subject of the symbolic order, then one is part of a filial network. And what I was trying to say is, and I wasn't the first person to say this, but as Fanon points out, the white filiation is a priori an unethical form of organization, because it's white family is like the grain of sand around the pearl of which the oppressive state has its relays of connection. Okay, so that's one way of being filial. The other is affilial, and that is your place in institutional realms that are based on interests. So I am a Democrat because I am for these types of policies, or I am a Mason because I'm for this, or I'm a communist because I believe this. So filial relations are predicated on secondary processes of signification, where it all has to make conceptual sense, and where you get to assert that through argumentation and analysis. The whole point is that blacks are objects, implements for sustaining the integrity of white and non-black filial relations, as well as affilial relations. There's no such thing as a black family, and there's no such thing as a black organization. Obama found this out. One can be president, but one cannot be presidential.
Yeah. There's another way of saying that, sort of that this notion of belonging is contingent upon anti-Blackness.
Yes, say it louder.
Yeah, that any notion of belonging, right, is contingent upon anti-Blackness, right? Anti-Blackness ultimately provides meaning for what it means to belong to some larger kinship structure, whether that be a family, whether that be a community, whether that be so on and so forth. That's kind of what I was picking up what you're saying.
Yeah. And it becomes dangerous when these kinds of conversations in other words, in a so-called civilized society like Western Europe and the United States, this can only exist and stability can only maintain as long as what I just said, the white family and the institutions, are not being analyzed through black absence in the way that Kevin is doing in his dissertation, for example. But once they are, then those on the other side are forced to make a decision, right? Either to say, fine, I like it like this, or to go through those, like this progression you set your watch by guilt, resentment, aggressivity. That's the white liberal. Yeah. The white senator is like, you're not telling me anything new. I think, and so, and once, because the threat is not just that we'll have this conversation, but that we might want to do something about it.
And I think on that note, we'll have to sort of bring tonight's evening to a close as we are running up against time. Professor Frank, sorry. Yeah, I know. Yeah, the format. Frank, thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope to have many more. Kevin, good job. And thank you guys. The Center for the Arts and Humanities plans to make a version of tonight's talk available, or video, I guess, available on its website, sort of in days or weeks to follow. So I'm sure the Santa Clara University channels will provide updates in programming and announcements and things like that. But one more time, if you guys could sort of help me thank our speakers once more. Thank you.
All right.